It was summer of 2018 when our team of entomologists set out for what was supposed to be an ordinary research trip. The purpose was to study an insect population that had been rapidly declining in a remote part of the Pacific Northwest. The area was dense with forest, untouched by logging or tourism, and almost entirely off the grid. It seemed like the perfect place to gather samples and data without interference from human activity. We were a team of 5, including myself. Most of us had years of field experience, and we prided ourselves on being prepared for anything. Our base camp was set up near a clearing a few miles off an unmarked dirt road. The only way to access the area was by hiking in with our gear, which we packed onto our backs and hauled over uneven trails. The forest was alive with sounds: the hum of insects, the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush, and the constant, soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the dense canopy above barely let any sunlight through, leaving the ground below in a dim twilight even at midday. It was both beautiful and unnerving. Our main goal was to observe and collect a species of beetle that had been reported in the area. These beetles were crucial for pollination, but their numbers had dwindled mysteriously over the past decade. We planned to stay for 10 days, long enough to collect specimens and monitor their behavior. The first 3 days went smoothly. We set up traps, documented the habitat, and recorded data. Each morning, we woke early to check the traps and log our findings. By mid-afternoon, we'd split up to explore different parts of the forest, marking our paths with biodegradable tape. The beetles were harder to find than expected. We caught only a few in the traps, and even those seemed lethargic. They moved sluggishly, their shiny shells dulled, as if they were sick. It was odd, but we figured environmental factors, perhaps pesticides from a nearby farm, might be the cause. On the 4th day, I wandered deeper into the forest alone. The air felt heavier the further I went, and the sounds of the forest seemed muted. It wasn't silent, but it was different, like the usual rhythm of life had been disrupted. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit, as if I were being watched. I stumbled upon a small stream, its water clear and cold. Nearby, I found several beetles clustered together on a decaying log. They didn't scatter when I approached, which was unusual. I crouched down to get a closer look. Their movements were jerky, almost erratic, like they were struggling to control their bodies. One of them flipped onto its back, legs twitching wildly before going still. I collected a few of the beetles in a sample jar and returned to camp. When I showed the others, they had similar findings: beetles behaving strangely, many of them dying soon after being captured. It was puzzling, but we assumed it was some kind of disease or environmental toxin. By the 6th day, things started to feel off. The forest seemed quieter, as if something had driven the animals away. Even the insects were less active. At night, the usual chorus of crickets and other nocturnal creatures was almost non-existent. That evening, as we examined the beetle specimens under a portable microscope, we noticed something strange. Tiny white filaments were growing out of their bodies, particularly around their joints. At first, we thought it was mold, but under magnification, it became clear these filaments were more like thin, root-like structures. One of my colleagues suggested it could be a fungal infection. Certain fungi are known to infect insects, taking over their bodies and even controlling their behavior. But this seemed different. The growth was unusually rapid, and the beetles' erratic movements didn't align with known fungal infections. We decided to keep the specimens in sealed containers and monitor them overnight. The next morning, we found that the beetles in the sealed containers had died. Their bodies were stiff, and the white filaments had spread, creating a dense, web-like structure that connected them. It was fascinating and disturbing at the same time. But that wasn't the worst part. As we were packing up to head out for another day of data collection, we noticed something odd about our surroundings. The trees near our camp had a strange, almost greasy sheen on their bark, and the leaves above had started to wilt. The air smelled faintly of rot, even though there was no visible source. We tried to shake off the unease and continued with our work. But throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest felt hostile, as if we didn't belong there. On the 8th night, I woke up to the sound of something rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it was one of my colleagues, but the noise was too erratic. Sharp bursts of movement followed by long pauses. I unzipped my tent just enough to peer outside. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow over the clearing. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the sound continued, circling the camp. The others woke up too, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. That's when we saw it. A large, writhing mass was moving along the forest floor. At first, I thought it was a cluster of insects, but as the beam of my flashlight landed on it, I realized it wasn't. It was the same white filaments we had seen growing out of the beetles, but this time, they were forming a network, spreading across the ground like veins. The filaments pulsed faintly, as if alive. They were moving toward our camp, slow but deliberate. Panic set in. We quickly packed what we could and left the rest behind. We followed the marked trail back to the road, but it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The once clear path was now overgrown, and the air was thick with that same rotten smell. We finally made it to the road just as the sun was rising. The forest behind us was silent, the tree leaned dark and foreboding. We reported our findings to the university and handed over the samples we had collected. They were sent to a specialized lab for analysis, but we never heard back about the results. A month later, I tried to find information about the area online. To my surprise, the region had been closed off, marked as a restricted zone due to environmental contamination. No further details were provided. Even now, I can't shake the memory of those filaments and the way they seemed to move with purpose. Something was wrong in that forest, something beyond our understanding. And the thought that haunts me the most, whatever it was, it's still out there, spreading. It was late October when I decided to take a trip to clear my head. Life had been wearing me down, and I needed a break. I wanted solitude, and nothing seemed more fitting than driving out to the middle of nowhere with my camping gear. I wasn't new to camping, but I had never done it in such a remote area before. I found a spot on an old map I had picked up at a roadside gas station. A small dirt road cutting through a dense forest, miles away from any town. It seemed perfect. I left on a Friday morning, the cool fall air crisp against my face as I loaded up my old Jeep. The drive was uneventful at first, the highways gradually giving way to smaller roads, then gravel paths. By early afternoon, I found myself on a narrow dirt road surrounded by towering pines. There were no signs, no markers, and no signs of life. I hadn't passed another car in over an hour. The farther I drove, the more I started to notice how quiet it was. Not the kind of quiet you get in a park or on a hiking trail. This was oppressive, the kind of silence that made your ears strain for any sound at all. It was eerie, but I convinced myself that it was just my imagination. I was too far from civilization for the usual noise of cars and people. After another half hour, I found a clearing off the side of the road. It was barely big enough to park my Jeep and set up a small tent, but it would do. The spot was surrounded by dense forest on all sides, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. I hadn't expected any out here. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent and laying out a small fire pit with some rocks I found nearby. As the sun started to set, the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark across the clearing. The temperature dropped fast, and I threw on an extra jacket. By the time I got the fire going, It was almost pitch black. The only light came from the flickering flames and the stars overhead. I sat there for a while, eating a simple dinner and listening to the crackle of the fire. The silence around me felt heavier now. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But I couldn't see anything beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. I told myself it was just animals, a deer maybe or a raccoon. Still, I kept my flashlight and a knife within arm's reach. When I finally decided to call it a night, I doused the fire and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, but I couldn't shake the unease I felt. I kept thinking about how isolated I was out here. If something happened, no one would know. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up suddenly to a sound. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. A steady, rhythmic crunching. Footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I listened intently, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the steps were too deliberate, too even. Someone or something was walking just outside my tent. I stayed perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, they started again, circling the tent. Whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time, as if they knew I was awake and listening. I reached for the knife I'd left by my sleeping bag, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped again, and this time, I heard something else. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across fabric. It was coming from the side of the tent. I wanted to yell, to scare off whoever was out there, but fear kept me silent. I lay there, gripping the knife and praying that whoever or whatever it was would go away. The scratching stopped, and I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the tent. I waited, straining my ears for any sound, but after a few minutes, everything was quiet again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in my sleeping bag, clutching the knife and jumping at every little noise. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally worked up the courage to step outside. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but I noticed something right away. The leaves around my tent had been disturbed, as if someone had been walking in circles. I also found long, thin scratches on one side of the tent. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different in the daylight, less threatening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The drive back to civilization felt like it took forever. When I finally reached the highway and saw other cars, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to know. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. That night taught me something I won't forget. Sometimes, being alone in the middle of nowhere isn't the escape you think it'll be. Sometimes, it's the beginning of a nightmare. It was late October, the kind of night when the chill seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I had decided to spend the weekend camping near a small border village in southern Texas. It wasn't the kind of camping trip I'd usually take. This one was more out of necessity than pleasure. I was between jobs, struggling to find stable housing, and camping was the cheapest way to buy myself time without draining what little money I had left. The village itself was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Rows of old houses stood along the main street, their faded paint peeling from years of neglect. It felt like the kind of place time forgot. I'd parked my truck on the outskirts, close to the woods but within walking distance of the village in case I needed supplies. The forecast had called for light rain, but by the time I set up my tent, the sky opened up with a fury. Heavy droplets pounded against the canvas, the sound so loud it was like being inside a drum. The wind was relentless, howling through the trees and rattling the flimsy poles of my tent. I was already regretting my decision to camp here, but there wasn't much I could do now. The ground quickly turned to mud, making every step outside the tent a chore. I managed to secure a small tarp over the fire pit I dug earlier, but the rain made it impossible to keep a steady flame. I gave up after a while, retreating to my tent and wrapping myself in my damp sleeping bag. My flashlight cast a weak beam of light, barely illuminating the cramped space. The rain wasn't the only thing making me uneasy. Something about the woods felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was as if the trees were watching me, their gnarled branches twisting in the wind like skeletal fingers. Every so often, I thought I heard movement outside. A branch snapping, leaves crunching, but it was hard to tell over the storm. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a stray coyote or raccoon. By midnight, the rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and I finally drifted into a restless sleep. It didn't last long. I woke with a start, heart pounding, to the sound of something outside my tent. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was deliberate, slow, heavy footsteps, squelching in the mud. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the small pocket knife I kept in my bag. The flimsy blade wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. I stayed still, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain dripping from the trees. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone or something dragging a long object through the mud. It was slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. My mind raced. Who else would be out here in the middle of a storm? The village was nearly deserted, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. I considered calling out, but something in my gut told me to stay quiet. The dragging sound moved away, fading into the woods. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity before mustering the courage to unzip the tent. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped out, knife in hand. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing deep grooves in the mud where something heavy had been dragged past my tent. I followed the marks for a few feet before stopping. The tracks led into the woods, and the thought of venturing in there alone was terrifying. Still, I needed to know what or who was out there. I put on my rain jacket and boots, every step feeling heavier than the last as I moved deeper into the trees. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the wet ground. The dragging marks continued, winding through the woods until they abruptly stopped at a large tree. My breath caught as I noticed something wedged between the roots. A tattered piece of fabric, soaked and caked with mud. It looked like part of a shirt, torn and frayed at the edges. There was no sign of whoever or whatever had left it behind. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I scanned the woods, flashlight trembling in my hand. Then I saw it just for a split second, a figure standing about 20 feet away, barely visible through the trees. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure was tall, with broad shoulders, and was dressed in dark, rain-soaked clothing. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their gaze boring into me. Finally, my legs kicked into gear, and I bolted back toward the tent. The mud slowed me down, and I slipped more than once, scraping my palms on the wet ground. When I reached my campsite, I didn't stop. I grabbed my backpack, threw it into the truck, and ripped the tent stakes out of the ground without bothering to pack it properly. The figure didn't follow me, at least not that I could see. But the feeling of being watched never left. I sped down the dirt road leading out of the woods, not daring to look back. When I reached the village, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath. The attendant gave me a strange look when I stumbled inside, muddy and drenched, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be somewhere with lights, people, and safety. Later that night, As I lay in the back of my truck in the gas station parking lot, I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the woods. Who were they? Why were they out there in the storm? And what were they dragging? I never got answers to those questions. When I returned to the area weeks later, out of morbid curiosity, the campsite was gone, washed away by the rain. But the memory of that night stayed with me, a haunting reminder of how vulnerable we are out there in the dark, alone, and watched. It was late October when my cousin, Ryan, and I decided to go camping in a remote part of the state. We'd both been itching to get away from the grind of daily life. We weren't exactly experts, but we'd been on a few trips before, and the idea of heading into the woods before winter set in sounded perfect. The spot we picked was deep in the Adirondacks, about a 4-hour drive from where we lived. It was an area neither of us had been to before, but we'd found it online, praised for its isolation and untouched beauty. The drive up was uneventful. The weather was chilly but clear, and the roads wound through dense forests that seemed to stretch forever. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already sinking low, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. There were only 2 other cars parked there, which was reassuring. We didn't want it to be crowded, but knowing we weren't completely alone out here was comforting. We loaded our gear into our packs and started the hike. The trail was well marked but steep, winding uphill through thick trees. By the time we reached the spot we planned to camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods were bathed in that eerie blue light that comes just before full darkness. We hurried to set up our tent, get a fire going, and settle in for the night. The first night was uneventful. We cooked some simple food over the fire, swapped stories, and stared up at the stars. The forest around us was alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves as some small animal moved through the underbrush, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But the next day, things started to feel off. We spent the morning exploring the area around our camp. The forest was dense, with towering pines and oaks, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. As we hiked, we found an old, overgrown trail that wasn't on any of the maps we'd brought. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, maybe decades. Curious, we decided to follow it. The trail led us deeper into the woods, where the trees grew so close together that the canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight. It was eerily quiet here, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. About a mile in, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were broken, the wood was weathered and gray, and the roof had partially caved in. But what struck me most was the feeling I got just standing there. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep unease, like we were intruding somewhere we didn't belong. Ryan wanted to check it out, but I convinced him to leave it alone. Something about the place made my skin crawl, and I didn't want to risk stepping inside. We took a few photos and headed back to our campsite, the unease following us the whole way. That night, the woods felt different. The sounds we'd heard the night before were gone. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just an oppressive silence. Even the fire didn't feel comforting. It cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. As we sat there, trying to shake the feeling, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Something or someone was standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, we found footprints around our camp. They weren't ours, they were too big, and the tread didn't match our boots. Whoever had made them had walked right up to our tent, then circled around the fire pit before disappearing back into the woods. We tried to laugh it off, telling ourselves it was probably one of the other campers we'd seen at the trailhead. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Why would someone come all the way out here just to walk around our camp in the middle of the night? We decided to stay close to camp that day. The uneasy feeling hadn't gone away, and neither of us wanted to risk running into whoever had left those footprints. We spent the day gathering firewood, fishing in a nearby stream, and trying to enjoy ourselves. That night, the silence returned. We kept the fire going as long as we could, but eventually we had to let it die down and go to bed. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, listening for any sound that might indicate we weren't alone. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me, but then I heard it, a faint rustling, like someone walking through the leaves. It was close, too close. I held my breath, straining to hear. The rustling stopped right outside the tent. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural breathing, just inches from where I lay. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to blink. I could hear Ryan's breathing beside me, quick and shallow. He was awake too. The breathing outside the tent continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, we packed our gear and started hiking back to the trailhead. The entire way, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We threw our packs in the trunk and got out of there as fast as we could. It wasn't until we got home and looked through the photos we'd taken that we realized just how close we'd come to something or someone. In one of the photos of the cabin, there was a figure standing in the shadows of the doorway. We hadn't seen him when we were there. I don't know why I agreed to go camping on a farm. Maybe I just wanted to escape the city for a weekend, or maybe it was the way my coworker, Dan, described the place. It's quiet, remote, and beautiful, he'd said. That was exactly what I needed after a stressful few months at work. So when he offered me a spot to camp on his uncle's farm in upstate New York, I packed my tent, sleeping bag, and enough snacks to last me 3 nights. It was early October, and the air had that crisp bite to it. The leaves were golden and red, blanketing the ground in a way that made everything feel postcard perfect. The farm was huge, stretching across hundreds of acres. Dan's uncle, Mr. Harper, didn't use all the land anymore. He was older and had let most of it return to nature. The main farmhouse was a good half-mile from where I planned to set up my tent, near the edge of the woods. Mr. Harper had said I'd have plenty of privacy, and that's what sold me on the idea. When I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. I parked my car near the barn, grabbed my gear, and walked toward the spot Dan had recommended. It was about 20 minutes away on foot, through a field and past a small, stagnant pond. The spot was beautiful, right at the edge of the woods, with a clear view of the stars overhead. I set up my tent quickly, unrolled my sleeping bag, and made a small fire with the wood I'd collected along the way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder, and I pulled on a thick hoodie. The first night was uneventful. I roasted a few marshmallows, listened to the crickets, and stared into the flames until I felt tired enough to crawl into my tent. I woke up a few times during the night. The sounds of the forest were louder than I expected. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, normal, I told myself. Just animals moving around. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I was too much of a city guy for this kind of trip. But then the sunlight broke through the trees, warming the air and chasing away my unease. The second day, I decided to explore the farm a bit more. I followed a dirt path that wound through the woods and out into an open field. The place felt enormous, and it struck me how easy it would be to get lost. I stuck to the trail, though, not wanting to risk wandering too far. I found an old, broken-down tractor half buried in weeds and a rusted barbed wire fence that seemed to go on forever. Around noon, I headed back to my campsite. The fire pit was still there, the ashes cold and gray. Everything looked untouched, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was hard to explain, a sense that I wasn't really alone. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to nerves. After all, I wasn't used to this level of silence. That night, things got strange. I just finished dinner, a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky, when I heard a noise in the distance. It wasn't an animal, not the usual rustling or chirping. It sounded like metal on metal, faint but distinct. I froze, listening hard. The sound came again, closer this time. It reminded me of chains being dragged across the ground. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam only illuminated the first few rows of trees. Beyond that was nothing but darkness. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was eerily quiet. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and moving toward me. Panicked, grabbing my flashlight, I backed away from the edge of the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's just an animal," I muttered to myself, trying to stay calm. But animals didn't walk like that. These were human footsteps. I kept the flashlight trained on the trees, expecting someone to emerge at any second. But no one did. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. I waited, my breath visible in the cold night air. After what felt like an eternity, I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tight and clutching my pocket knife. Sleep was impossible. Every little sound outside made my heart race. The third day, I was exhausted. I wanted to pack up and leave, but pride kept me there. I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't handle a couple of nights alone in the woods. So I spent the day gathering more firewood and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. By evening, I felt a little better. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, and for a moment, I thought I might actually enjoy the rest of my trip. Then I found the footprints. They were in the soft dirt near the fire pit, large and deep, like someone had been standing there watching my tent. My stomach turned. I hadn't seen anyone all day, and the path I'd taken through the woods had no other tracks. Whoever had been there hadn't come from the trail. They'd come through the trees. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my backpack without bothering to fold it properly. By the time I was ready to leave, it was nearly dark. I strapped on my headlamp and started walking toward the farmhouse, my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. The walk back was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump, and the shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. Halfway to the farmhouse, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were behind me, matching my pace. I stopped, turning quickly and shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. But when I started walking again, the footsteps resumed, faster now, closing the distance. I broke into a run, my boots pounding against the dirt path. The footsteps behind me quickened, and I could hear heavy breathing, mine or someone else's. I wasn't sure. I didn't look back. I just kept running, the farmhouse lights finally coming into view. When I reached the house, I banged on the door until Mr. Harper answered, his face a mix of confusion and concern. I didn't stay to explain. I jumped into my car and drove away, leaving the farm and whatever was out there behind me. I never told Dan or anyone else what happened, but sometimes late at night I think about those footsteps, about the person or thing that was out there in the woods watching me. I wonder if they were just trying to scare me, or if I'd interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see. All I know is I'll never go camping on a farm again. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone. I had recently turned 27 and felt like I needed some time to reset. Life in the city was noisy, chaotic, and exhausting. The thought of being out in nature, with nothing but the sound of leaves rustling and birds chirping, sounded like the perfect escape. Black Pine Forest was the place I chose. It was about a 2-hour drive from where I lived, and it wasn't as popular as some of the other camping spots in the state. That was part of the appeal. Fewer people meant fewer distractions. I wasn't much of a social camper anyway. I wanted isolation, peace, and quiet. I arrived early on a Friday morning. The parking lot was empty, just as I'd hoped. I pulled my gear out of the car, a tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, and a small first aid kit, and slung my backpack over my shoulders. The trail into the forest was well marked, but it still had that wild, untamed feel. The trees stood tall and dense, their branches intertwined like a natural canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through in patches, casting long shadows on the dirt path. I walked for about an hour before finding a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides, with a view of a narrow creek about 30 yards away. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth rocks. It felt perfect, secluded but not too far from a water source. I pitched my tent, unpacked my things, and sat down to take in the surroundings. The forest was alive with sound. The chirping of crickets, the distant cawing of crows, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what I needed. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it exploring the area, following the creek upstream and admiring the beauty of the forest. I didn't see another soul the entire time, which suited me just fine. By evening, I was back at camp, lighting a small fire to cook dinner. The smell of roasted sausages filled the air, and I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. The warm, golden light gave way to a cold, bluish hue. Shadows stretched and deepened, and the sounds of the forest grew louder, more pronounced. The chirping of crickets was joined by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of undergrowth. I told myself it was just animals, a raccoon, maybe a deer, but the unfamiliarity of the sounds made my skin prickle. I went to bed early that night, tired from the hike and the fresh air. My tent was small but comfortable, and I had brought an extra blanket to ward off the chill. As I lay there, listening to the forest outside, I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. It was the kind of silence that wasn't truly silent. The hum of insects and the distant hoot of an owl were constant reminders that I wasn't alone out here. I woke up just as the sun was rising. The forest was bathed in a soft, golden light, and the air was crisp and cool. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore further. I left most of my gear at camp, taking only a water bottle, a snack, and a small knife for safety. The forest seemed different during the day, less intimidating, more inviting. I followed the creek downstream this time, curious to see where it led. The terrain grew rockier, and the trees became thicker, their gnarled roots twisting across the ground like veins. I noticed signs of wildlife, hoof prints in the mud, a half-eaten mushroom, but no actual animals. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon something strange. It was a small pile of rocks, stacked neatly in the middle of the path. It wasn't natural. Someone had placed them there intentionally. I stared at it for a moment, trying to decide if it meant anything. Maybe another hiker had been here recently, marking the trail or leaving some kind of message. I didn't think much of it and stepped around the pile, continuing on my way. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest seemed quieter here, as if the usual sounds of nature had been muted. The air felt heavier, too, like a storm was brewing, even though the sky was clear. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to turn back, realizing I had wandered farther than I'd planned. As I retraced my steps, I passed the pile of rocks again. This time, though, it looked different. The rocks had been knocked over, scattered across the path. My stomach tightened. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, but the arrangement had been so deliberate. It didn't make sense. When I finally made it back to camp, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The sight of my tent, my small fire pit, and the familiar clearing was comforting. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was overthinking things. The rest of the day was quiet. I stayed close to camp, gathering firewood and reading a book I had brought along. But as evening approached, that sense of unease returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me look over my shoulder. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat by the flames, eating dinner and trying to ignore the creeping fear in the back of my mind. The forest felt alive in a way that was different from before. Less welcoming, more oppressive. I stayed up as long as I could, staring into the fire and listening to the sounds around me. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left my knife within arm's reach, just in case. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves and chirping insects. But as I lay there, straining to hear, it grew louder, a soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on the forest floor. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer to my camp. I wanted to convince myself it was an animal, but the pattern was too human. Step, pause, step, pause. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly as I listened. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, slow, steady, and too close for comfort. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I call out, make noise to scare them off, or stay silent and hope they'd leave? Then the tent shifted. It was subtle, just a slight tug on the fabric, but it was enough to send me into a full-blown panic. I sat up, clutching the knife, and shouted, hoping to scare off whoever, or whatever, was out there. Silence. The breathing stopped, and the forest went eerily quiet. I stayed frozen, knife in hand, listening for any sign of movement. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and eventually, I heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of the tent, knife still in hand. The clearing looked the same as before, but something felt off. I walked the perimeter of my camp, searching for any signs of who or what had been there. That's when I found it. A single footprint in the dirt, just a few feet from my tent. It was large and unmistakably human. My stomach churned. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling as I worked. The hike back to the parking lot was the longest 2 hours of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But the forest remained empty, at least as far as I could tell. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors the moment I got inside. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I never went back to Black Pine Forest. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. All I know is that something wasn't right, and I was lucky to make it out. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 18 years old. My dad's friend, Mark, invited me to join him on a weekend camping trip in the dense forests of northern Idaho. Mark was in his mid-40s, a rugged outdoorsman who had been camping and hunting for years. I had always admired him, and since I was trying to bond with him and learn a few survival skills, I jumped at the chance to join. Mark said it was the perfect time to visit because the weather was clear and the forests were teeming with wildlife. He promised it would be an easy, relaxing trip, but something about the way he described the remoteness of the area made me a little uneasy. Still, I pushed those feelings aside, packed up my gear, and joined him early Saturday morning. We drove for hours, leaving behind paved roads and entering a maze of dirt trails. Mark had a beaten-up old truck with tires that seemed impervious to the jagged rocks and deep potholes we encountered along the way. The further we drove, the more isolated we became. Cell service vanished completely about an hour into the drive, and the trees seemed to close in around us. Eventually, Mark pulled over at an unmarked trailhead. There was no sign, no indication that this was a campsite, just a narrow footpath disappearing into the woods. Mark grinned at me and said it was one of his secret spots. I nodded, trying to match his enthusiasm, though the silence of the forest and the overwhelming sense of isolation gnawed at me. We grabbed our gear and started hiking. The trail was narrow and overgrown, with branches scratching at our arms and faces as we pushed through. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the ground and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After about 2 hours of hiking, we reached a small clearing next to a creek. Mark declared it the perfect spot to set up camp. The creek was crystal clear, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Despite my unease, I couldn't deny that the area was beautiful. We pitched our tents a few feet apart and built a small fire pit using rocks from the creek. Mark showed me how to properly set up a bear bag to keep our food safe, and we spent the rest of the afternoon fishing. The creek was full of trout, and we caught enough for dinner within an hour. As the sun set, the forest grew eerily quiet. The temperature dropped quickly, and the darkness was absolute. Mark lit a fire, and we cooked the fish while he told me stories about his past camping trips. He seemed completely at ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows cast by the fire seemed to dance and shift, and every now and then, I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but the unease persisted. We turned in early that night, exhausted from the hike and the long day. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there listening to the sounds of the forest. At first, there was nothing but the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, around midnight, I heard it. It started as a faint snapping sound, like twigs breaking underfoot. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was clear that someone, was walking through the woods near our campsite. I wanted to call out to Mark, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Instead, I lay perfectly still, clutching my pocket knife and staring at the thin fabric of my tent. The footsteps circled our campsite, slow and deliberate, before fading away into the distance. The next morning, I mentioned it to Mark, expecting him to brush it off. Instead, he frowned and said it was probably an animal, but there was something in his tone that made me think he wasn't entirely convinced. We spent the next day exploring the area, following the creek upstream and scouting for wildlife. Mark seemed distracted, constantly looking over his shoulder and scanning the trees. I asked if he was okay, and he just shrugged, saying he had a weird feeling. That afternoon, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. About a mile from our campsite, we found a small makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves. It looked hastily constructed, but what really disturbed me were the items inside. A torn sleeping bag, an old pair of boots, and a rusted hunting knife. Mark examined the items carefully but didn't say much. He suggested we head back to camp, and I didn't argue. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder and more erratic, as if whoever or whatever was out there was circling closer. I gripped my knife tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, like a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. Mark's voice cut through the darkness, calm but firm, telling me to stay in my tent. I heard him unzip his tent and step outside. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard Mark's voice again, low and steady, as he told me to come out. When I stepped outside, Mark was standing by the fire, holding his rifle. He didn't say anything, just pointed to the ground. There, in the dirt, were massive footprints, human footprints. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. Mark kept the fire going and his rifle within arm's reach, while I sat clutching my knife. Every now and then we heard noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but nothing came into the light of the fire. At dawn, Mark announced that we were packing up and leaving. I didn't argue. We quickly broke camp, loaded up our gear, and started hiking back to the truck. About halfway back to the trailhead, we found something that stopped us in our tracks. Tied to a tree was a bundle of sticks and animal bones, arranged in a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. Mark swore under his breath and quickened his pace. The rest of the hike was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us. When we finally reached the truck, Mark wasted no time throwing our gear into the bed and starting the engine. As we drove away, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but that relief was short-lived. About 10 minutes into the drive, Mark suddenly slammed on the brakes. There, in the middle of the dirt road, was another bundle of sticks and bones, identical to the one we had seen in the forest. Mark didn't say a word. He just reversed the truck, turned around, and took a different route. We made it back to town without further incident, but the experience left a lasting impression on me. Mark never talked about it again, and I didn't press him. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with us, but every time I think about those footprints, those bundles of sticks and bones, and the eerie silence of the forest, I feel a chill run down my spine. I haven't been camping since,